Okay, so we're going to have a conversation now about optimizing research collaborations between prosecutors' offices and researchers. I think yesterday we had a couple of presentations that show some of the power of those collaborations, but obviously every office operates a little bit differently, every researcher operates a little bit differently, and to kick us off and start the conversation is not really new anymore, I guess, like 2 years now. Professor here at Penn, Sandy Mayson, who has been a part of the Quattrone Center since 2015 when she came as a fellow. And so every time I introduce her, I get to say that we get to claim her incredible accomplishments for the rest of her career. So Sandy, thanks so much for being here and leading this off.
Thanks, John. And anything I ever do that is positive in any way, it's obviously due to John. And also Paul Heaton. My goal for this conversation is to have an informal conversation about data infrastructure and analysis and dissemination in prosecutors' offices, drawing on all of your expertise and work, and also including the audience. So I hope that as we're having this conversation, you will all write questions that you have on your cards, and I'm sure John and Paul will be around to collect them. Hold on. I have to issue a brief caveat and apology at the start, which is I have a facial nerve problem that is acting up a little bit now and making it somewhat difficult to talk. So, hold on. In lieu of introducing these panelists, I will ask them each to say a one-sentence introduction.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aurelie Ouss. I'm an assistant professor in the criminology department, and over the past 3 years have been partnering with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office to conduct research on prosecution and criminal justice reform.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Redcross, and I'm the chief of the Strategic Planning and Data Analytics Unit at the Bronx District Attorney's Office. I've been there for about a little more than a year and a half, come from a research background. I was a researcher at MDRC for 24 years before that. So.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Michael Hollander. For 4.5 years, I was the director of analytics and assistant director of the data lab at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. I left a few months ago, and now I'm the vice president of data innovation at Heights, Philadelphia.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Marielle de la Cruz. I'm the assistant supervisor of research in the data lab. I've been with the DA's office for 4 years almost, and almost 2 years in the data lab. And before that, I was in the victim witness services division in our office. And I also come from a research background, and I'm a second-year PhD student at Temple University.
Hi, I'm Wes Weaver. I'm the current director of analytics at the District Attorney's Office. I should say we're sort of sitting in for Dr. Oren, who's the director of the data lab. He is out because he had a baby on Tuesday, so he's busy.
Good morning. I'm Greg Ridgeway, professor and chair of criminology here at the University of Pennsylvania, and also professor of statistics and data science, working closely with Aurelie on a lot of our work that you saw yesterday during the discussion of research in the Philadelphia DA's office, along with these fine people from the data lab.
All right, fantastic. So almost everyone on this panel is in some way affiliated with the data lab at the Philly Defender Office. Let's start, if it's all right. Mike, perhaps, as the longest tenured data lab person here, I think, can you give a brief intro to the data lab? What is it? How has its trajectory compared to what we just heard from, I'm sorry, I'm blanking, Matthew.
Sure. Thank you. And so the data lab it really follows on the work that Matt started in Chicago. So it was built on this idea when DA Krasner was elected that data and research were fundamental to building a better criminal legal system. So on the day that DA Krasner started, Dr. Oren also started with him. There was a director of research from day one. I started about 8 months later. And then we built up this idea and also built up through the generous funding of Arnold Ventures and Chen Zuckerberg, the idea of having a data lab built within the office. So we're not in charge of the case management system. the Data Lab is in charge of thinking about data, interpreting data, analyzing data, and interfacing with researchers. So I don't even know how big the Data Lab is at this point because it's even grown in the few months since I left. Here, I'll leave this here. But it's approximately 14 or 15 people. I don't know if CJ, do I have that right? 14 or 15 people within the Data Lab. That's both researchers and data analysts. And then there's also connections with lots of other researchers outside, in particular with the University of Pennsylvania's Criminology Department, where we have a long-term multi-project research project, but also with many other universities outside.
That's a good segue. Greg, can you explain the relationship with the Penn team?
Yeah, I got to say, like, the most valuable thing that we did was embed several data scientists with the data lab. So these are junior data scientists, great R programming skills, great data science skills in general. And we got them integrated with the folks at the data lab. So they're sitting at DA computers and with access to the analytical data files. And this has really been like sort of I was surprised. This was sort of the innovative part of the project, getting people embedded in the lab, not just to pull data, but to get to know how the prosecutorial process works. A former Penn law professor, Stefanos Bibas, wrote about 20 years ago about the role of plea bargains in the justice system. Sort of complained about researchers, focusing so much of their effort on juries. Why were researchers doing that? Because there was data on juries, and so little research on plea bargaining. Why? Because there was so little information about the plea bargaining process. So when we start wondering, how does plea bargaining work? We have data scientists sitting there at the data lab and can pull the data. And a lot turns out to be missing. So they start pulling the boxes and they start looking at the files and see it's missing because there was no plea officer, or it's missing because the plea officer was rejected immediately. So that was really one of the key innovations of the project, just getting good data scientists embedded at the data lab to collaborate and learn. And I've been on many projects where the data set gets sort of pitched over the fence to us, and we get it, and we're going I don't know what these missing values mean, I don't know what these columns mean, I don't know what it really means, but this is what's been really transformative about this project, getting those folks embedded there. Maybe Aurelie wants to add.
Yeah, in addition, we also had some PhD students, and that was great because they come in, their job as a PhD student is to, do research, define research topics, and they have a lot of time to really spend, understanding what's going on. And so they were also able to spend a lot of time, shadowing prosecutors and going really into the details. Again, they were embedded as well. So they were joint employees of, they were students at Penn, but also employed by the DA's office, which overcomes a lot of the important, protection of individuals aspects that don't work if you're not actually embedded in such within a prosecutor's office.
Just to make sure we have the full landscape of expertise here, Cindy, could you explain the data situation at your office?
Yes. Actually, it's very different. So we in the Bronx County, we don't have a formal collaboration with academics. We do have some partnerships, but I'll talk about that separately.
And Cindy, do you want to bring the mic a little closer to your face?
Sorry. Yeah, sure. Wow, I'm usually such a loud talker. Okay. So in the way that it works in Bronx is we're building it. We're pretty much building it right now. That's how we kind of refer to it. That we're building the ship as we're having to fly. So when I was brought on. I was excited as a researcher and just loving data and loving criminal justice. I was excited to learn when I came on that our office receives feeds every day from all of the different criminal justice agencies in New York. And so we have feeds coming in to our office from NYPD when they file a case. They also file incident reports to go along with those arrests. We have court data coming in every day that kind of feeds into our system. We also have data from the jails coming in. So it was a tremendous amount of data that was all being stockpiled in a warehouse with no one who knew how to use it. And so when I was brought on, kind of the goal of the office was we need to become more data informed. We need to, we're tired of operating on anecdotes. So there was a recognition that we don't have the capacity internally, and we really need to get this built up. The office kind of used the excuse there was a sort of legislation that got passed that actually is forcing all of the DA's offices in New York to publish our data. So, I mean, look, whether or not, I guess that you could say that the office picked that up and was like, this is why, so used it as kind of an excuse. So I walked into that. What I didn't know I was walking into was zero capacity, like zero. There were two data analysts that they had kind of like using Excel and making pivot tables, really not knowing how to analyze data. And so I kind of called them a little bit of heroes because they were doing that with zero guidance, almost like, grad students would do, like if they had no training at all. So anyway, there were some good things about coming into that environment, but also challenges. And so I quickly, and the other sort of, I guess the thing that we recognized that we needed immediately was, I was like, we need to build out an actual data management infrastructure, and I can't do that. And so I know it needs to be done. I can scope it out, but we need support. So we just didn't have time to sort of seek funding to do that. And so I had to convince the DA and the executives that why we needed this, that we needed to set aside, we need to hire a consultant to come in and help us. And luckily from my networks, I knew who we should go. We went to Luminosity and sort of basically got the DA. I had a lot of meetings with the DA to explain what was needed and why we can't do this ourselves. And the difference between, we have 50 people in IT, but it's not the same as data analytics. So that was the first lesson. So anyway, so she eventually put it into the budget. And so we have them on board. They are taking these feeds and sort of transforming them into data tables that are then being sort of cleaned up, merged, matched to create research analysis files. But in the meantime, we are constantly, we're very reactive. A lot of the things that Matthew said really resonate with sort of, we have a set of internal dashboards, and we are developing a set of external dashboards. But it's kind of different metrics. And I guess I'll just say it's all a process. It requires a lot of work, and we're getting there, but it's a different model. It's a different model from what Philly did, but sort of, I guess maybe the idea was probably triggered by that. The office's understanding at all that data of why it's important to be able to use this data and report on it. So stop there.
That's great, very helpful. Let's throw it back to Wes and Marielle, who are now running things at the Data Lab in Philly. We've heard about Cindy's sort of data infrastructure challenges. Are you guys still facing data infrastructure challenges? What are they? What is the primary challenge in your view to the work that you're trying to do now?
Yeah, I guess it's always a process. There are a lot of things that happen in our office that are still not captured. A lot of data that we just don't get because we're still running on like a 20-something-year-old case management system that we're in the process of improving. But as Matt said, everything in government takes years, so we're working on it, but it's going to take longer. And I think this is actually brings it back to what Greg said, like the advantage of having like researchers in the office is they can go pull files. So like while we might not have it digitally, like having people in the office to go like pull the file, look at what the attorney wrote down helps a lot. And it also informs us. So as we're like continuing to build out this case management system, it helps us know like what are we interested in? Like what are the decision points that we need to be tracking? Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge is that there's a huge amount of, there are a huge amount of like decisions that are made in a case, a lot of like points that of like importance that we need to keep better track of. But the longer we're here, the longer that list grows. So yeah, it's ongoing process.
How about you, Marielle? You came from, of everyone on this panel, I think you came from most intense immersion in the work of the office itself.
Yeah.
Do you, given that perspective, do you have a different take on the limitations of where we are with the data?
Sure. Yeah. I would say the biggest challenge in the office has been, kind of like building that relationship between the practitioners in the office and the data lab and the researchers. I think the Penn team recently did a fabulous job in the office in terms of like, with our research to action. I think someone kind of quoted that yesterday. We're building this process where we're taking the research that we're learning from our Penn partners, our Temple partners, and sharing it with the rest of the office. And I think the biggest challenge for me specifically, because I've come from a background of victim services and advocacy, is that we don't have good victim data, for example. And so we're not able to capture the experiences of people who are being harmed. And so for me, a big part of, next step for us is to be able to capture that and in the future, maybe a long time in the future, like removed from now, to have some sort of dashboard for victim information, because I think that's important to me, specifically in my advocacy. So I try to bring that voice, and I also come from community organizing, so in advocacy. So a lot of, the other voice that I try to bring is bridging the community into the work, not just research partners and practitioners as our partners, but having the community grassroots. Philadelphia is a big, big city for grassroots organizations and community-based organizations. So bringing them along in the conversation is important as well.
I want to ask, how do you do that? How are we going to do that? But Aurelie's furiously writing notes. Do you want to jump in, Aurelie, with whatever's on your mind?
I don't know where to start. No, first, again, I think this is, in past positions, I have collaborated with other criminal justice agencies, and I agree with Greg that really having an embedded team is something that is unique to my experience. And I want to say, it comes with, we talked about the advantages, but then I do want to kind of, relate to what you just said, Marielle, which is, I think, for me as a researcher who has access to this, it's an incredible privilege because I can learn things that I would never have learned, really understand the data, the processes, ask different questions that come from these observations that, again, I do want to say, mostly the data analysts and the grad students have been doing while being embedded. But at the same time, it takes a lot of energy and effort to put these relationships in place, and also, raises questions of equity as to who has access to these kinds of data. And I think there are interesting trade-offs to think about, which is, again, I'm infinitely thankful that I'm able to do the work that I do. But I recognize that, we ask a ton of the data lab, and they're very generous in everything they allow us to do our research. I don't know if you could do that with 10 different partners, either institutional partners, university partners, and or community organizations. So it comes at very large costs to you all. And I think it's interesting because, I don't know that, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office has embedded research. I don't believe you do. Okay. Right. So you do have some embedded researchers, but also you have a lot of, I think it's fair to say you have case level data that's available for anyone to pull, and the Philly DA's office doesn't. You have more aggregate data, but less individual data. And at the same time, using individual data that's publicly accessible limits what questions you can ask for, again, very good reasons. You want, first and foremost, to protect the privacy of the people who are involved within the system. So there are these trade-offs in terms of who has the ability to ask what questions. And, again, they're just complicated trade-offs to think about.
So that leads to a meta question I wanted to ask you all, and that is these data analytic operations within prosecutors' offices. Who are you accountable to as data analysts within a prosecutor's office?
That's a good question.
And who should you be accountable to? I think it's really tricky. There's an important role for independence from various stakeholders, but you're also an entity within the office. Now, Mike, why don't you start off talking about the dynamics in the Philly office?
I'll start, and maybe I'm like the most unfettered because I don't work at the DAO anymore. So it's a complicated question, right? Like I think that the data lab, one of the fundamental principles that underlay Oren and my thinking as we created the data lab, and I think everyone in the data lab, or I can't speak for everybody, but I think this is it, is that like we need to be able to get data to the public. We need the public to understand what's going on. We need to get them data in a way that they can understand the data, right? And so a lot of what Matt was talking about really resonated of you could put a dashboard out, but it doesn't mean anyone's going to look at it in the right way, understand it. You could put public data sets out. Nobody knows how to use them. There's a lot of complication with that. Even when we make these simple dashboards, there's a lot to misunderstand or just not to be able to understand to read. People see a page full of numbers and graphs and their eyes glaze over. My eyes glaze over when I look at other offices' dashboards, even though it's the same data that we have on ours, because there's just so much out there. And so there is this fundamental idea of how are we accountable to the public, right? But we work for a government office. We work for an elected official in the district attorney's office. And so there is some notion that you're working for that office and the goals and interests of that office, right? Which might be different than the general goal of the public good. And that sounds strange, right? But each office has its needs and its desires. And as an elected official, right, the head of that office has a political agenda, a personal agenda, a thing that they're shooting for within the office. And so that means that you're accountable to that person as well, and the needs that that person has, which might not necessarily be in conflict with, but they're just like the Venn diagram, the overlapping circles aren't quite the same, right? And it actually, one of the things that Marielle was saying before, that you sort of touched on this, is there's this like, one of the difficulties is the political reality of being in an office, right? And I don't mean that from the standpoint of, so-and-so wants to be elected again. What I mean more is like the newspaper might have written an article yesterday about some issue that it saw anecdotal based, maybe not anecdotal based, but it might pull you away from whatever the long-term goal you had as a data lab, as an office, as a researcher, right? And so what we found ourselves in the data lab doing a lot was you might have some longer-term idea that you're trying to focus on, but you're like never getting to it because you're also accountable to the media or whatever the needs of the office are. And hopefully the media is being driven by, the desires of people in the public, although it's obviously not always true or it's slanted. But I don't mean slanted in the way that the media is slanted. I mean it's slanted in the way that they're interested in the things they're interested in. But it means that you're often getting pulled away from whatever the thing that you think you should be accountable to in the long run, criminal legal system reform, accountability to the public, making these really great websites and explainers to be able to answer the question in the newspaper the next day, right? And that's really, really complicated and difficult. And the answer is obviously different for researchers of who you're accountable to, but I imagine that being an embedded researcher and one who's a repeat player with people in the office and you're trying to establish good relationships, again, there's some accountability to the people in the office, which forces you to take a step to the side of where you might have thought that you were going based on, if you sort of had the, a really nice diagram that you wrote out ahead of hand of who you're accountable to and how you answer questions.
And maybe this is a good place to explain a little bit. I think there are questions, how does it work concretely? As researchers, we have, again, something Matt talked about, MOUs or DUAs or whatever acronym you have, but that is basically saying like how researchers can and can't use data. And one thing is like, any researcher who collaborates, one thing universities really care about is independence. We can publish whatever. There's no, there's no question in terms of, will I or will I not be able to publish my results? But, something that researchers may think about is, oh, well, are people still going to want to work with me if I ask this question? So not so much what the answer will be, but, willingness to ask questions, which I hope we always hope that you're being honest and asking all the questions you want, but these are also the realities of, these MOUs get renegotiated, and maybe this is something that, you want to keep in mind as you're thinking about different models of sharing data and embedding researchers.
Can I just add, would it be helpful if we explain what we mean by embedded? Because I think we said it a lot, but I don't know if it's clear what that means. I don't know.
You can say a few more words. I think you've said like sitting in the
Yeah.
office using the computers.
Yeah, and well, there's like specific legal reasons why we did the embedding the way we did, right? So in Pennsylvania, there's privacy laws that would prevent the DA's office from sharing lots of information externally. And there's ways to deal with those laws, and Matt explained some of them, right? And we can de-identify data, and we can have MOUs and stuff. But actually, the way the law is written in Pennsylvania, we really can't share data externally unless it's de-identified. And then, there's other things that come along with that, right?
And in some of your states, you might have the same law. It's the Pennsylvania Criminal Records Information Act, which was the result of a template privacy law that was promulgated in the 70s. So a lot of states have analogs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that law was written in the 70s, really has not been amended very much since then. And so the way that it has no acknowledgement of computers, it has no acknowledgement of research, right? Like there's literally just like if the data is basic criminal legal data about people, you can't share it, right? And so we've sort of like read it and interpreted it in ways that it says identified individual. So if you de-identify, but what does de-identifying mean? Anyway, all of it's really complicated. And so one way around that was you can work in a criminal legal office, right? So you can work in the police, you can work for the district attorney's office and so on, right? And so my background before I was at the DAO is I'm an employment lawyer, right? And so we thought about how can we employ people at the DAO who are also employed elsewhere. And like employment law has this idea of joint employment. I'm not going to get into all the pieces, but the idea basically is that Aurelie is both an employee of the district attorney's office and of Penn at the same time. And DAO doesn't pay her, but the DAO provides her with a computer, with a workspace, and other types of control over her work, not control over what her research is, not control over the questions she asks, but it allows Aurelie and the other data scientists that we mentioned to be able to sit in our office and look at our data directly without having those same de-identification techniques and all the work that we might have to go through to be able to provide access. And that's been like a super, super important part of this relationship, is being able to give that unfettered access to researchers on this particular project.
Greg and Aurelie, for offices, people in other offices who might be contemplating initiating research partnerships with academics or beginning to build out data capacity, what should be the first steps? What should be the priorities?
Cindy, did you want to add something before?
Oh, sorry,
yeah,
Cindy,
yeah.
please.
I just wanted to add, I wanted to just sort of say something about a tension that I've observed between academic researchers and sort of the DA's office. Oftentimes what I sort of feel like it's a complicated story, but researchers typically want to ask, they're asking maybe different questions than what the day-to-day sort of prosecutors and DA's office want to answer. And I see that tension coming up often because I'm a researcher. I have all these big picture questions that I want to answer. Someday maybe I will after I stop having to respond to like the Post article or whatever. Yeah. But we're trying to collaborate with sort of academic researchers to answer the bigger questions, but a lot of times the funding, so academic researchers are, to do a research project often funded by Arnold or the feds, and the questions that they're asking our office is like, but I just want to know how this is going to affect our office policy. Mm-hmm. I want, yes, we want to know if this gun diversion program works, of course, but we also want to know what can we do to sort of support that program working and being effective? What are we doing wrong? And so I find, I guess I'll just find that funding matters, and sort of the research, the questions that are being asked are often different, and the goals for the research are often different. So it's a
Can I speak to that real quick? Go ahead. Yes. So part of my role in the data lab is to, when we initiate, after Mike left us, I took over looking at all the MOUs and the data licensing agreements and drafting them with the researchers and following it through the process for, approval and the negotiation phases. But part of, the good part of having a research team in the data lab, not just the data analyst, is that we're very essential to that process, because what often happens is that, the researchers will come to us with a question and formulate it in very specific ways and have, this set of variables that they want to look at in the data. And we also have a data dictionary that outlines those variables and those data points. But, from my background and in the research assistants in the data lab, we try not to, change the research questions too much, but we do play an important role at the end of the research process, where we really try to, work together with the researchers to come up with recommendations or policies for the office. And obviously those are not always implemented, but some things are implemented from the findings from the research. And I think that is kind of like something that's successful. And I think it could be modeled in other places, because that way you have the people who are very embedded in the office, knowing the day-to-day and knowing, kind of like the work, who are providing those feedbacks. And we partner very closely with the ADAs and the line ADAs, and we also partner very closely with supervisors of each unit. So part of it is just, I say this all the time, part of it is just talking to people. It's just having a conversation and finding that common goal, because practitioners, they want to be experts all the time, specifically attorneys, right? And researchers want to be experts all the time, because they have, gotten a PhD and have specific areas that they're experts in. But when we come together and we share those expertise, I think it's more powerful than playing the, I know more than you because I've been doing this 10 years or whatever. So I think I'm a good kind of moderator in that way, where I'm okay, come on, we got to just do the work, play nice. But so yeah, I think there's always going to be challenges, but I think there's ways to mitigate those challenges.
So this is great, because two of the questions we've gotten from you guys are about how you maximize using the resources to produce work product of interest, both internally and externally. And one answer is you just have Marielle on staff. But more broadly, I think the point is that having someone who can moderate between the internal office constituencies, the lawyer, the line ADAs, the victim witness coordinators, and the outside academics and data scientists can be crucial. Does anyone else on the panel want to speak to this question of strategies or specific things to do to that end? Greg?
Yeah, sure. So very, very early on, before that we started, we developed a joint list of projects, and it must have been with Mike and Oren, and I don't know who else was all involved in that, but we have, Aurelie, 7, 8, 9, 12 projects. And we just sort of said, these are our first direct, this is our first focus, to get these projects done. Now, naturally, that changed over time because of the embeddedness and getting to know, like Lindsay had an opportunity. You heard from her yesterday about the failures to appear. And that became because we had the embeddedness made it possible for her to shadow some ADAs, and she realized just how much time these ADAs were spending, like cajoling people to show up, and so that was like, hey, we think we might have something here. I think we talked to the Data Lab team and said, like, this might be something we should push a little further, and they were on board. So it's developing this list of projects from the beginning and then allowing that to evolve over time as we make discoveries, as new issues emerge in the Data Lab and in the DA's office, those sort of project ideas developed.
I also wanted to just build off what Marielle has said, just to be very concrete. And I think, I think this is I found it extremely valuable. The way things work, so Greg kind of said step 0, how do we come up with the research idea? Then typically what happens is, the research team does a first version of their research. We tend to internally present our work to get first feedback in terms of, you're completely wrong in interpreting this variable, or, have you considered looking at this subgroup? Because based again on the expertise of people who work there, maybe this is special and you learn something special about this group. So then we iterate our research. After a while, we have an academic paper. And again, here it's really like, more for an academic audience, and, to be very concrete, it's kind of jargony. It like speaks to academics and may not be the most interesting thing to practitioners. However, in parallel, we try to have research for all of our research projects, also a policy memo, which is shorter, about 2 pages. Sometimes, me personally, I'm like, this is not interesting to you guys, it's just an academic paper. And I've been convinced otherwise by having people who looked at this research and said, look, this part is actually really interesting. Can you highlight this? And so the 2 work products are sometimes very close, and sometimes a little bit different, because what researchers will care about isn't necessarily exactly the same thing as what practitioners will care about. So we iterate a lot on the more public-facing, or I don't know if public-facing is the right way, but policy-oriented, shorter, less technical memo. And so we try to release jointly these 2 work projects and iterate a lot, especially on the more public-facing memo, which is, again, like, based on our research, but with huge inputs from Marielle and Marielle's team and the Data Lab team to understand, to make sure we're highlighting things that will be most interesting to the office, the broader public, the community, that we may not necessarily see ourselves.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, there's another sort of aspect going back to who are you accountable to, right? Like thinking about the fact that you are accountable to different audiences is really important, right? So what Aurelie's talking about is 2 types of accountability, right? There's accountability back to the sort of the research community and needing to have things written in a certain way and in a certain style so that appeals to and sort of meets the norms of that community. The one-pagers are often, they're both for internal, but a lot of that's also thinking about how is this going to be received and understood by the public, right? So, and the public broadly, right? So that could be like sort of public officials, that could be the newspaper, that could be people on the street, and just sort of like thinking through how it's going to be received by them. But the third audience is this internal set of ADAs, right? Or the case handlers, right? I don't want to just say ADAs because paralegals are doing a lot of work on these cases too. And their concerns are often very different and focused very differently than the other 2 groups, right? And what that meant, I think, in a couple of different things is sometimes it's translating the research differently for those people, or making sure that the right questions are in there, or the right couple of graphs, or sort of like, sub-questions are in the research. I think some of it, too, is the Data Lab spent a lot of its time focused on providing different kind of work for ADAs and other case handlers, like every day, right? So, whereas the big research question might be talking about, like trends in guilty pleas, right? Like a case handler doesn't care about trends in guilty pleas. They care about the court system and the case in front of them, right? So the head of the majors unit might say, what I really care about is like how many guilty plea or how many cases are listed in each courtroom on every single day over the last 6 months, right? And that might be far, far more interesting and helpful for that person to think about how to staff courtrooms and do their job than, are there more pleas today than there were last year, right? They're not thinking longitudinally about big picture stuff like that all the time. A lot of times they're just thinking about like, how do I get my work done? How do I get my people into court and out of court? Are there judges that are wildly unfair in one direction or the other? And so, bifurcating our work in some way where some of it's based on this longer term big picture research and some of it's based on just how do I deal with cases day to day is really important, and having a data lab and a research team together is helpful because then those questions can be split more easily, where the research team is thinking about things over the course of years and we're thinking about things for next week.
Can I add one more thing to that?
Sure.
I think one thing that happened recently, a little story that I think really good example is there's a lot of stuff that happens in the district attorney's office that is not just ADAs. Like there's like Mike mentioned paralegals. So we had this event the other day. Lindsay and Aurelie and Sandy came to present the systemic failure to appear research that was presented a little bit on yesterday. And one thing that our chief of staff did, which I really thought was a good idea, was invite the people that use the phones, like people that make the calls. And which is not an idea that we had. It was like his brilliant idea, because like they're the people that are gonna like be impacted the most by this if we change policy. Like they're the people that are gonna have the best ideas probably. So yeah, I think just like being imaginative about like how this research comes back and like the different areas that it can impact. Yeah, it's been a lesson, especially as a lot of this research is like, you know, coming back around to us. So
I'll piggyback on that, Wes. Oh, did you want to? Go ahead, Marielle.
Oh, I was just going to add, in same project, we were having the conversation and preparing the presentation for the office. And usually when we have a manuscript or some sort of academic paper coming out, we give the chance to the unit supervisors to kind of look at this paper and have a conversation and interact with it in some ways. And so when we were having the conversation with one of our unit supervisors around the FDAs, you know, she was like, this is all great. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. But can you tell me this, right? From the data that you have, this is what will be helpful to me. So, you know, like going back, you know, now Aurelie and her team has, you know, a new task to do, but it's very helpful to hear and interact in that way, and to hear them come up with questions, you know, regarding like what's most helpful to them, to, you know, for them to know.
I want to follow up, insert myself on this panel substantively, but follow up on their comments to just highlight how useful it is not only for researchers to be embedded in the data lab where all of the data is being analyzed and evaluated and processed, but in the operation of the office and the system itself, because researchers often, you don't really understand how the system works. Various people on the panel have said this before, but the data that exists in the data lab and that shows up on dashboards, it's not as if that data has always existed in the form that it does and will always exist in that form. It's the product of a process of the system. And the very data that the system produces is a function of the questions that we ask of it and the things that we're attuned to. So at this event last week, the woman who answers the phone, I believe it was Lois, Lois, who answers the phones, came to our presentation and had wonderful information about who calls the office. She sits there all day picking up the phone and talking with victims and witnesses and police officers and what they say. That's data that the system hadn't captured before, but now because we have this new channel of information transmission in place, we will. I want to seg to a question an audience member asked about non-traditional metrics, data metrics. The question is the data lab pursuing the measurement and analysis of non-traditional metrics, including qualitative or survey data of users, how they experience and perceive the system, measuring trust, satisfaction, et cetera, things that we heard about yesterday in the legitimacy and procedural justice conversation. You know, are you doing that? And to the extent not, how do you panelists, is there a vision of the future in which if data analysis in prosecutors' offices plays a role in reshaping our ideas about what data should exist?
Sure. I think first I will speak to the non-traditional, like qualitative piece, because this is something that I've been kind of like preaching about for a long time. I think to be able to capture, data is important. Data tells stories, depending on how you're looking at things. But I think when you are, conducting research in such a unique place, like a prosecutor's office or the criminal justice system, we're talking about people, right? Like these data points are people who have been both, justice involved or injustice involved, and I think it's important to capture those voices when we do qualitative work, even though there's more rigor, right, to doing qualitative work. I think it is important to incorporate that when we're looking at prosecution because of everything we shared about certain things not being in our case management system. So, certain research questions are only going to be able to be answered through a qualitative lens. The second thing about doing non-traditional and collecting information. I would say one of my big, I always say this, when I start at a job or like a new position, I always give myself like 5 main goals that I want to achieve before I move on. And one of the main goals for me was to incorporate more of the community engagement into our process in the data lab. And we piloted a program with one of our grassroots organizations in the city of Philadelphia called the CoLab. And basically, the non-traditional part of the CoLab is that we try to, engage with the community to, kind of engage in a way where it'll be helpful to them, and how data can be shared in a community where they can understand it, they can use it, and not just mapping out the negative qualities of our communities, but also getting to the idea of asset mapping, and just, highlighting the assets of the communities in Philadelphia. And we did really well, I think, with the pilot, and just recently got a big chunk of money to grow this project. And so we're looking to hire 5 new people to be part of this community engaged research part. So that's a non-traditional way. And then my other big goal, and I want to really do this, is to model something that San Francisco did with their victim services unit, where they were collecting information through survey about satisfaction and trust building, and specifically measuring what did victims in San Francisco think about criminal justice reform. And they did that through a survey, and did it for like 2 years, and then produced a report about it. And that's kind of like where I see us having a role in the future, those kind of like non-traditional ways of collecting information and, using it internally. So.
And one other thing to that too is another thing that we've been focusing on, like, so we have a lot of like criminal legal data, and so we do criminal legal metrics, but another thing that we focus on is like non-legal information. So non-legal data, we're like exploring 311 calls and like the spatial distribution of illegal dumping, for example, and like how that's related to crime, and simple changes that you can make, like streetlights. Like, are streetlights out? Like, is that correlated with certain incidents? Like, can we like use our weight in city government to like influence how streetlights are fixed? Like, can we like kind of push government here and there to do these things? So we're getting there, but I think that's a non-traditional metric, I guess. So yeah. And
just to add on too, the one big project that we have worked on that involves qualitative data is Dr. Ward and Chika, I'm going to say your name wrong, I apologize. Really, who are sitting in the back, at Temple have been doing a lot of work to do qualitative surveys about people in the criminal legal system, mostly actors in the criminal legal system like prosecutors, defenders, judges, and other people about the reforms that our office has made and how they've been implemented. And so this is sort of like a meta survey about how the reforms have gone from a sort of like a political standpoint if you're within the system. And one of the big difficulties is getting responses from people that aren't in the DA's office, right? So a lot of the findings are really interesting, and a lot of them are about our office's perception of itself. It's very difficult to get people in the defender's office, for example, to respond and tell us what they think about our things, because like, why do they care, right? And it's like, which I get.
They presented yesterday.
Cindy had something. Yeah, go ahead.
I think we're kind of, it's kind of circling around a point that I wanted to make, which is sort of bridge that gap between academic research and sort of the prosecutor's work. I sort of feel like there needs to be, like, you should use mixed methods, I guess, is the way that I would have described it, where it seems to me like you can't actually fully understand or properly interpret the data without those qualitative sort of data collection upfront, probably before you even design the study or figure out exactly what your question is. Sort of these start with the qualitative research, start with the implementation research, and then kind of weave it in and use the way that I kind of describe it is use that to interpret what you're seeing in the quantitative research. And yeah, I feel like that would probably solve a lot if academic researchers came in and really just went in listening mode initially, because I hear my boss, she's like, they're not even using the right terminology. They have no idea what our it just doesn't represent well, and it starts off badly if kind of academic researchers haven't done the background of what terminology do they use, because every criminal justice system is different. There's some overarching similarities, but mostly they're different. And I've just heard, I feel like, just to give an example, we just started an evaluation with an academic partner on a gun diversion program. And therefore, so they came to our office sort of quickly realizing, wait a second, we can't actually just evaluate this program without bringing in the prosecutor's office, since we're the ones who are making the plea agreement and sending the defendants to this program. And so I almost feel like if I wasn't in the room, it would have completely fallen apart, because they were, there was just a lot of miscommunication. We got to the MOU, and it was like, my boss is asking questions about the MOU that I know are standard. Like, she's like, why are they saying this? Why are they backdating? Like, lawyers are really, like, wanting to know. And I feel like just coming from research, I was able to kind of alleviate her, oh, no, it's not, they're not trying to trick us or anything. This is, they probably just want to cover the contract or, just really basic things. And I was like, if I wasn't here, I really feel like this would have fallen apart, like, at stage one, because of the... and even they were also making assumptions, because my boss is asking, what are we going to get out of this? And they kind of she asked it in a way like, we want to know what we're going to get out of this. They're asking us to do all these things. What are we going to get? And so I tried to pose the question as, we want to understand, my boss, Carey wants to understand more about the deliverables and sort of what you'll produce. And they immediately, the reaction was they made assumptions about why she was asking that. And they were like, look, we have to be independent. We can't, if this isn't going to work, if we're not independent with what we say. And I was like, that's not even why she's asking. No, she's really just asking because she wants to get something out of it. She's not asking because she wants to control what the narrative is at the end of this. So it was just like really, it was crazy. I was like, wow, that's completely, they're both misinterpreting each other. Totally.
This is kind of the conversation, part of the conversation I wanted to have on this panel, because we've been talking about all the great stuff that's going on at the Data Lab, and it is great, but it hasn't been totally smooth sailing. And Mike, could you share a little bit about what's been most challenging from an internal perspective, collaborating across the different constituencies with different goals and interests?
What's been there's so many difficult things. I'd say, let me see, I'll pick one. When research comes back, or at least comes back in some middle state where it's mostly ready to be presented, if it says something good about our office, there's no friction. Like everything's great, everybody's happy, right? There's questions like Mariella had about like how can we ask these extra questions that might make this more useful to us, but it's really just like, oh, this is wonderful, can you help us answer this? When research comes back and it doesn't say something good about our office, that's really complicated to navigate, right? And that's when all of the knives come out. It's when the death by 1,000 questions starts happening, like picking apart every little piece of the data, picking apart every decision that was made, questioning the credentials of the researchers, all of this stuff. And so sitting in the middle of that and navigating that is really difficult because you find yourself in a weird position as the translator there, right? When you're talking to certain policymakers within the office and people who are sort of responsible for public-facing things and worried about what this research might say, you're like defending the research in some sense. And then when you're talking to the researcher and trying to bring the concerns of the office, you're like defending the office, right? You're like in this weird position where you're trying to translate for both directions. It's very similar to what Cindy was saying, right? Where you're, depending on which direction you're talking, you're like wearing a slightly different hat or you're like defending a different position to try to make sure everybody understands where everybody else is coming from. Really, 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 really complicated. I think the other thing is that especially for case handlers, and I would say lawyers in particular, and I'm a lawyer, but there has been a lot of lawyer bashing today, considering we're in a law school. But lawyers are trained not to think about trends, right? Like when I learned how to do legal research, right, and about a case that's in front of me, it's what are the facts of this case, and let me find a few other cases from a higher jurisdiction that have similar fact patterns that I can fit myself into and then make a decision about this specific case, right? You might have trends like the thrust of the law is this way, or there's lots of cases in this one direction and there's only one that has the same fact pattern that you have. But fundamentally, lawyers are trained to think about the case in front of them and the very specific fact pattern that's in front of them. Researchers are the opposite, right? Like researchers are thinking about the big picture, the long-term picture. And that just fundamentally puts researchers, and I think the data lab often, right, at loggerheads with the case handlers in the prosecutor's office. And so that's also, it's like a meta thing that's complicated, but it's complicated. It's complicated for people to understand, like, why should I care that there's been an increase or a decrease in this? And the answer is hard to explain sometimes, right? Because it's hard to say why you should care, because you are dealing with 30 cases in front of you right now, and you have to prosecute each of those cases tomorrow, right? So you might not care what the trend has been for the last 10 years. But the office as a whole has to figure out a way to think about those things, to make policy about those things, to change practices because of those things. And so connecting that, how does this day-to-day thing work, and I think day-to-day, to how does this thing look in the big picture, but to affect the big picture, we have to affect the day-to-day, is really, really also difficult. So it's maybe less difficult in the fighting kind of way. The fighting comes in when the research doesn't say what we want it to say.
Greg, Aurelie, what's the academic pitch? What can we researchers pitch to prosecutors' offices about why it's worth their while to engage in these really resource-intensive partnerships?
I just want to back up a second, then maybe Aurelie can tackle that one. I mean, to Cindy's point, I mean, researchers have had traumatic experiences with, prosecuting agencies in particular. I mean, I've gotten cease and desist orders on research. So there are sort of reasons why, whoa, you're going to try to filter what I'm saying. So there's some rationale behind that. I had a federal public defender assure me that my research was going to result in the dismantling of the Federal Defender Service. Yet, we still have a viable Federal Defender Service, still operating today. It's all turned out all right. And then I think Mike brings up a great point about this sort of tactical reasoning versus strategic reasoning, like the case focus versus the long-term plan. So I remember presenting, again, it was a federal defender. I said, on average, this kind of case is taking, this many hours of labor. and they're like, what? You can't possibly talk about an average for this, because once I had a case where a guy shot a wolf, but he was in a state park, and the wolf was across the boundary in a national park, and it involved state law, and it took me, 30 million hours to do that case. How can you talk about an average? And it's like, there's this difference between talking about that tactical case that lawyer remembered so well, and me just lumping all the cases together and saying on average cases take, 36 hours or something like that. Sorry to interrupt your point, but those are just like, I just wanted to respond to those two issues.
What about, so given that difference, do you guys have a pitch to make to all the prosecutors' offices out there considering academic partnerships?
So I'm just going to repeat what came out back last week, because it's true. We do. So again, last week when we were presenting for the first time the academic research we had done to the Philadelphia DA's office, and one thing that came out was kind of taking the flip side of, you work on particular cases. If you want to change policy, well, then it's more palatable to be like, this thing I observe on a day-to-day basis, actually, it's not just me, it happens at scale. And so this is something that I think is helpful from a policy building tool, to have researchers be able to take, individual cases and then aggregate them up and, hopefully give a little bit more high-level trends that can be helpful to design policy. So this is one example, but go ahead.
Do you want to know what actually works? You just started a new diversion program. Does it do what you thought it would do? Is it affecting the right people? Is it targeting the right people? Are the outcomes, 12 months after, better than before, or at least, what you were hoping to achieve? So if you're genuine about wanting to evaluate your programs, this is a natural thing to do. Partner with an independent research organization and find out if the policy changes actually work.
And the other huge luxury that researchers have, and that came out of this panel, not everybody has, is we don't have to answer to the press. So we actually get to spend our time answering these big picture questions in an independent way, where we don't. There can be of course you're saying it works because you're working for this office, and so we do have honestly the time and the bandwidth to be able to just make progress. That is a huge luxury, and hopefully can help answer these big picture questions, which are really important. And I know you may not always have the bandwidth to do as much as you would like to.
Bandwidth brings us around to the real key question here from the audience: who pays? These things take lots of resources, personnel, and capital investment. So who pays for all this data work? Who pays now? Who could pay in the future?
I can take part of that anyway. So at least for us, we were sort of kicked off with a pretty sizable grant from Arnold Ventures and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. We started before then. I was hired 4.5 years ago, before the Data Lab existed. So we were starting to put together a team, but then we really expanded when we got access to that money. We're approaching the end of that money, and we're making plans. And the office has adopted us. They're gonna pay for us going forward. We're just institutionalized in the office now. So the office is paying.
And our team also got a grant from Arnold Ventures, along with the team from Temple that you heard from yesterday. That was necessary, I think, to kick things off, a pretty sizable grant. However, going forward, we're also kind of winding down. We were able to stretch those funds. I think it was supposed to be a 3-year, and we stretched it to 4 or something like that. But as our grant kind of winds down, I think we're finding, very efficient ways to keep our data scientists embedded. Even though our money's running out, we have new funds to hire a new data science to couldn't possibly replace our data scientists, but they're off to PhD programs in economics and public policy, and the next generation of data scientists is going to come in. So we're going to try to keep this going.
And again, this is as researchers, we are always looking for opportunities to learn things. And so both as professors, but as graduate students, that is another resource that is really valuable, where actually the most valuable thing we can get is access to this information and this data to understand things. And so partnering with researchers and grad students, PhD students, master students can be really another thing. Like what we get is like research that we're able to conduct. So even just access to this information can be really valuable for academic partners.
Cindy, do you want to say anything else about your situation?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm adopted. So yeah, we're staff. My unit is staff. We have 7 people, and the office is fully invested. But DA's offices also run on budget, so the way that they were able to kind of get the funding for our unit and to maintain it was actually, well, like, you want us to publish data, then you have to give us the resources to collect that data and analyze it. And so every year, some spin of that argument continues to be built into our funding requests.
So it sounds overall it's a mix of grants and internal funding line items in the DA's budget. We've got about 7 minutes, and I'd like to end this conversation looking to the future and to further collaboration with other offices. Each of you, we heard Matthew's experience in Cook County and the Philly Data Lab experience and your initiative that sounds like you single-handedly have been getting up and running.
I'm psyched for it, yeah.
So you've each been operating in your own silos, more or less. Is there opportunity moving forward for you to build on your respective experiences to make it easier for future offices to start up data operations? What can we do to facilitate this work elsewhere?
I think there are a number of working groups that are talking about this around the country. I think one that we're involved in a lot is the Fair and Just Prosecution data group. So we're one office of many offices that are involved in this. Each of them have a data team or an interest in developing a data team. So we're talking to them, and traditionally they've just worked with the elected prosecutors. They've recently started a group for data people. So that's one way, these kinds of working groups. There's also APA, who is here. We were just in Miami for their conference on data and dashboards. So I don't know, people are getting together and they're talking, and I think that's the best way. We have, I think, a significant amount of experience now, good and bad experiences that we can share and help people out. So we're come talk to us. I think, I mean, I'm sure you're talking to other offices too, right? So I think communication and these working groups is probably the best way forward, right?
And I will add, actually have a big role next week because the FJP invited our team to come talk to the elected prosecutors. Just talk about research partnerships and collaborations and how they can do this in their office. So I'm very, I only have 10 minutes, so I don't know how I'm gonna do this in 10 minutes, but that's another way too of just kind of building, building the conversation and just, continuing to talk about it. And then, 10 years from now, this would not be so much of a new conversation, hopefully.
In New York, it's actually interesting. So the 5 boroughs are 5 different counties, and so they have 5 different prosecutors' offices. Obviously, Danny is fine, but the other 3 boroughs, I've actually joined with the mayor's office. I basically am going to help joint effort to provide TA to the three other boroughs that don't have that internal capacity yet. And so that's kind of my contribution. I actually got permission to share code, because we're all taking in the same feeds. So my office is fully opening our doors to whatever I can do to support them, as long as it doesn't, it's not too much of my time. But yeah, so that's promising, I think, for supporting other offices.
That's great. Any last words, Greg, Aurelie, Michael?
I was actually just going to add in, and I think this is the hard question, right? Is it's easier in places that are well resourced, and like when Aurelie and team came in, right? We understood our data fairly well. We had it organized in a way that was easy to use. We had a data dictionary, and when we partner with other researchers, we have the same, and so we're way ahead, I think, and it makes it easier for the researcher. So I think one of the questions that is worth answering and thinking about from the research standpoint is like, what do you need or what can you come into an office with that can help them when they really don't have a data team, let alone a data person? They might have a chief of staff who does some data stuff on the side, and their data is not cleaned and they don't understand it as well. So I think that's like a big thing to think about and to work on. And I think that's a lot of the offices involved with FJP are in that position.
Right. I am going to exercise moderator's privilege and end this conversation 5 minutes early. Thank you all so much, and a big thanks to our wonderful panel.